the background to today's event in terms of a talk and conversation is a piece of work which is 1440 frames, which Rob has, which has happened today. Rob has installed the work and it's actually still installed, so it's a central tripod here. And basically the 1440 frames relates to a rotation of 360 degrees within a space, and 1,440 frames are taken within that rotation of 360 degrees over a 6-hour period. And that number of frames, when run at a conventional speed of 24 frames a second, if everything is right, makes a 1-minute film, which is what is playing here. So this is actually a 1-minute film of a 6-hour period of what happened in this space throughout today. If everything had gone well, then this machine would still be running, so that it would be rewriting the data, so constantly updating that 1-minute sequence, so that by the end of the talk, you'd actually see ourselves on the screen. As technology is a wonderful thing that hasn't quite happened, but I think it's an important, this idea of rewriting is something that I'm sure David, Sue and Rob will talk about. What I'll do is briefly introduce a little bit more extensively. Rob graduated from the Royal Academy in Sculpture, and his work has kind of developed very much through technology and through these kind of pieces of work. And there's a tension between the idea of an object and an interface, and I think that tension is very much evident in the piece downstairs, the roller coaster, which then is an object which facilitates an animation, which Rob will explain further, but an animation is generated through the object. So a lot of Rob's work hinges on an idea of a looped system. So again, I think that's probably something, I'm just trying to kind of throw ideas that will then explain a broader background for the conversation. So again, in terms of this rotation of 360 degrees, there's an actual physical loop, there's conceptual loops in terms of the time frame relating to a minute sequence, and that's a kind of recurring feature of Rob's work, and I think that feeds into the work that Sue's currently doing, so that's something of importance. David Cotterill has just had a kind of split show, which is partly the Daniel Arnaud Gallery and partly the Wellcome Trust, and that was work that responded across photography and video film to a period of time spent in Afghanistan with a medical corps unit at Camp Bastion, and that was the kind of collective title for that was Aesthetic Distance, and something that came out of that, which may or may not be relevant to the conversation, is something that David talked about on the radio. He talked about, he was an observer in terms of because it was a medical unit, so there were wounded soldiers coming through that system, and because of the nature of the trauma of war and the severity of woundings, people for that duration were heavily sedated, so in effect there's some idea of lost time within that part of their life that may or may not be something that gets talked about. There's two much older pieces of work which I thought would be relevant as a kind of background to David's work. There's an idea that basically David adopts technology in alignment with conceptual concerns, and there's an old piece which is called the Paranoia of London Attaché Case, which we have the still for it. Yeah, I'll just describe it quickly. It's a live piece that David produced where it's shown on 7 monitors, and the 7 monitors show the same 22-minute period of time, and all the footage is from 81 cameras across these 7 monitors throughout the London Underground system, and it basically tracks the movement of a person carrying an attaché case But why I think it's relevant to tonight's conversation is basically David deployed the apparatus as a live event, so that once the first moment had been set in action, then all the rest was dictated and maybe open to chance. So this idea of a deployment of an apparatus, which is relevant to what Rob does in sets the camera in motion. So, and there's one other piece which is from 2001, which is called Car Culture, where David had a camera fixed, there's probably still as well, and it filmed out the back of his car as he drove along the motorway, and he purposefully drove in the fast lane, attracting people to, in a sense, tailgate him. So there's this kind of sense of aggression to the piece. But the most interesting, or why it's relevant again here, is that David removed a point of decision making in terms of the way that the film is edited is relative to a point at which the number plate can no longer be read because the car tailgating has got too close. So therefore that's the point of the edit. So I'm sure this is something that David will expand on. So that's just to throw a little bit of sort of other background. Obviously we're at the Siobhan Davis Studios here, which is courtesy of Sue. Sue's been here since 2006, the building.
Yes.
Sue's work has been, as a choreographer, has been critically acclaimed for a long period of time. There's pieces such as Wyoming, White Man Sleeps, Plants and Ghosts, and Bird Songs, which are all highly critically acclaimed. Currently, Sue's working on a joint project with a set of dancers in conjunction with artists at the Victoria Miro Gallery. So what was happening here today in the space was a rehearsal for that, or part of that process. The piece is called The Collection, and it's a series of, or what Sue's instigated is a series of short sections relating to an idea of 1 minute, so that the dancers are working on these small segments which then get expanded over the period of the dance, and it's very much to do with an idea of whether or what happens when people engage with the art, with the work, with the dance, how they come in and out of the space. So they're kind of phases of movement really that have been set up. So again, maybe there's a sense of loop or a negation of a start and finish point. Maybe those are things. I'll hand over very shortly. Just there's a couple of other points just to throw in the air as a sort of loose parameter. There's an idea of something of what Rob's termed an auto-aesthetic, which is related to the idea of an apparatus determining the outcome of the work. So there's a removal of decision process, so that the aesthetic of the work is dictated through the parameters that have been set prior to its deployment. So I think that idea is maybe something that I hope can be picked up on. And David perhaps negotiates a similar idea of auto-aesthetic, but in a slightly different context with his newer work, which looks at visualizations of mathematical or technical data. So again, it's systems of data which create their own aesthetic point. So I guess the key things are ideas of that auto-aesthetic, the deployment of an apparatus, and the rewriting of data. So I'm going to hand over. If people want to join in the conversation or have points to raise while that's happening, then that's totally permissible. We would encourage that, and I'll keep an eye out for that. So just make it, just talk, I guess. Maybe a good start is if I hand over to David to maybe direct a question or something relating to the piece that we have here to Rob.
There are lots of things we have in common, so it's interesting. It's hard to pick up the most pertinent thing, but I suppose when I stopped painting, I was searching for an environment where I would have a variable vocabulary, but in a sense still control over the white cube of sorts, even though I knew that I wanted to work beyond the gallery. And what I gradually found was that systems or programming or other environments which were essentially not physical environments offered me that kind of control. And that's, I suppose you can think about that games design, deciding where the horizon
is. Your framework.
Yeah, it's just the game design decides where the horizon is and how far you can walk before you get to yeah, I suppose. Like the kind of everyone's seen the Truman Show, the last scene of the Truman Show where he drives a sailboat into the wall and you realise the sky isn't the sky, it's just the end of the boundary of the environment. And I want to see it. Oh yeah, sorry, I'm just ruining the Truman Show. It's the best bit of the film. But I was wondering if in some sense that is also part of the pleasure that you get from making your work, despite the kind of some sense of distance that you put yourself away from your work by making mechanisms make your work, by having a kind of godlike control.
It is, yes, it is a way of controlling the outcomes of the work to a certain extent. And you, by laying out a system, I suppose it's important if you want to sort of describe something or allow a chance to happen within an artwork, you have to have a framework for that to happen within. So if you were just to have an open camera shutter, then there's no sort of mediation of that. So it forms a structure in which you can rationalise and understand. Yeah, have control. And I suppose that's, I guess it's a fundamental thing about how I look at things. It's wanting to form a framework and sort of into. Yeah.
I suppose the interesting thing is when you make a painting, it's very obvious you take the control. When you make a machine that then uses probability or some random numbers to make an end result, there's some ambiguity as to how much freedom you give the machine. And is that helpful in allowing it to possibly deal with things that it might be hard to shout out with your own voice? Is it easier in a way to make the machine and allow that to stand alone?
Yeah, I mean, it's. The apparatus is key to a lot of my works. Going right back to, I think probably the first really explicit use of the apparatus is in this water wheel in 2002, where I deployed a water wheel in a river, and inside I placed a rock with some abrasive grit, and just left it in the river to grind the rock down into a pebble, and then I presented the pebble in galleries where it was produced. And this was when I realised that through an apparatus you were able to allow a certain removal of the subjective artist from the artwork, and yet you could bring things like chance events such as flooding, random water gushing down rivers. It brought in other issues and things where uncertainty, as we've demonstrated perfectly with the apparatus tonight, which, there's that sense of it being something live and not just a fixed, static thing. There's a duration that is implicit within the artwork, and so although it's not always live, and there's a sense that I suppose what I can say is you deploy the apparatus, and then at the moment of its deployment there is then the duration. So in the studio tonight there was 6 hours where the camera would pan around the room, and with the water wheel there was the length of time when the stones went down. And so there's...
So for you, in terms of the importance of the apparatus and what that apparatus is showing, I mean, what's the balance? I mean, we're talking a lot about the apparatus, but the thing that is very relevant, the rectangle within the camera moving around, or perhaps the block that's inside the water wheel blowing it down. I mean, is it the fascination with the system and the apparatus, and then what it's like, what it's looking at is secondary, or I'm interested.
Which comes first, the apparatus or the subject?
For you, yeah.
That's an interesting question.
But this maybe relates to the piece downstairs, the 60-second roller coaster, where you've described it to me as in one sense, the result of that work is the animation that is created through the piece downstairs. Basically has a camera, and it's a series again of still frames which have been taken, and it's traversed through the loop system of the roller coaster, and then those are sequenced back into a moving time frame, so that's an animation. So again, it has a time-lapse aspect to it. So there's the outcome in terms of the animation or the film section, and then there's also this interesting fact that you then described it to me in terms of, was that an excuse to make a physical object, which is why I think it's interesting to come from a sculptural practice initially.
I have talked about it as this perfect excuse to make a beautiful, wonderful object, but at the same time, I mean, I guess it's about striking a balance between the two. Like, the roller coaster is just a pointless, dumb object without the animation, and if the animation is in any link to the deployment of the roller coaster within this space, and so then to then sort of show the recorded animation not in relation to the object would, I think, make it uninteresting.
You were referring to the animation as opposed to what the animation is recording, and what I'm wondering is the matter of the roller coaster's pace.
Well, I mean, the work is open to be redeployed, and it's made in a modular fashion, so it can be taken apart, it can be redeployed, and that's the nature of an apparatus. And sort of, I suppose it's, or the apparatus as I see it, it's not only deployed, it's redeployed in various situations, and it's maybe not particularly the subject that's recorded, but I suppose it's the relationship between the space where it's deployed and the recording of it. So equally, it's really interesting in the foyer downstairs and the architectural details and the movements of the people that it captures. But I think it would be equally interesting to take it onto a rooftop and record sort of the different details and the different sense of the space that you get. And it's about a sort of physical relation to the space where it is, rather than particularly, I'm saying, gosh, look at this particular drawing space. And it's, I suppose as well, in the animation sequences, you're capturing as if by chance, or through, you're not making an aesthetic choice about what is captured. The system is already laid out before the process starts. So the instances that you capture in the animation, the stock frames, individually they can become very aesthetically pleasing
But I think for me this is why I'm interested in this idea of loop, because certainly with this piece, I mean, that idea of repeated deployment is interesting because this is the second time that this apparatus has been deployed, and so although it's very contained, its function is always that it can be deployed again or elsewhere. And I think the piece downstairs has that same opportunity. And maybe that, for me, there's something in that idea of, although in some sense you've closed a set of parameters, within that closure or that loop, there's an inherent opportunity for the loop to be repeated, or for it to be deployed elsewhere.
I think that's right, that's an idea. Because when the piece downstairs, you described that there were little screw holes, and I noticed that when I came in, that it is potentially deconstructible, and then you could add in sections to make it 12 times as big if you want. But it may never happen. I mean, you haven't got immediate plans to do that.
No.
But the fact that that's built in as an option affects the meaning, because then we think about it as an observational device rather than purely as something to celebrate this centre here, or as a direct relation. Because we're tuned to look for a kind of a contextual relationship between artwork and its location, particularly outside a standard gallery space. I think it's quite interesting sometimes when it's deliberately left open as to whether it might be something which could be manipulated to look purely at the technical relationship between the object and an audience, rather than technical object and this particular audience. It may be more of a symbolic reference rather than necessarily a practical decision. With the car culture thing, I never made it again, but the rules potentially meant that anybody who was willing to travel 70 miles an hour and fast make 2,000 miles could remake that piece, and it would be just as authentic. But it wasn't necessary. It was just, but in a way, by making it so that it was a set of parameters, I mean, it wasn't about London and Glasgow. It was really just about the strange relationship between obsessive driving and the melodramatic aggression that occurs between people in cars when they're playing out this bizarre, kind of psychological warfare in a banal environment. And as soon as if I left it open to be a personal decision as to where it was from and to, and that being relevant in some way, then I would then have to have another set of explanations to kind of qualify why it wasn't really about the way Scottish English people behave or the way that people behave in the M1, because that wasn't the subject. So in a way, I suppose the opening of parameters or closing them down for me is about trying to avoid being distracted onto subjects which aren't the core focus of what I'm trying to make. And I get the feeling some of your work it's the same way I used to teach filmmaking very briefly, but I've never been a proper filmmaker. And one of the things I talked about with the students in the first few days is kind of trying to watch TV and recognise the difference between the way the shots are held. And most of them never use a tripod in the first few weeks when they ran out of weight film. And you watch a film on a tripod, you watch a film handheld, scooting around the room. The difference is that when it's handheld, you see the filmmaker all the time. You see the filmmaker as a person in the shot. You're not actually watching them, because it's a roving eye, like your own human eye. On a tripod, it becomes neutral to some extent, and you start looking at a window through into another world. And so you might lose some parameters, but you've also gained some control. You don't have to then apologise for the absence or appearance of something which is irrelevant, which is this roving camera operator. So I'm wondering, maybe in some ways, deliberately restricting it to 360 degrees. It's deliberately restricting the time frame, deliberately controlling the environment, and it means that you can concentrate on the mediated experience or the way in which you can synthesise something which appears to be purely emotional. That journey through on the video, the animation, it's deliberately not one frame exactly at the same time as another frame. It's got some probability, which means that when you're watching it, you do get some sense of anxiety in the same way as if it was a real roller coaster. It's a slightly bumpy ride, and it's a slightly uneven ride in the same way as if it had been taken with a time-lapse camera on a real roller coaster. When you look at the object, and of course it's impossible. There's no wheels on the device go down to where it is, so it's a smooth, perfectly finished object. And so you've got this kind of built-in irony.
But it's just, I did, when I was doing that, it did seem to become, because I did it by hand rather than as an automated device, there was this element of me as I almost felt like a performer within the artwork, which is very different to this where I went out for the day. I just popped it down the gallery and went out. And so there was this, it took 7 hours as well, which I was really surprised by this. So I was there and I was moving this around and marking down the edges of the sculpture by hand. So this hand-made element got built into the animation. And I don't know,
I think that
maybe I pose this as a question, but how does it affect the meaning of the work to put me back into the work as an active agent within it? And it's, do you see what I mean? That I've sort of managed to step out of this more like that down there, and I was wondering about how it, I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts to that.
Well, you've allowed yourself back in, but as a participant within the system you've set rules for. So you're back in there as one of us, you know, as something that has to follow the rules. And we're not allowed to suddenly speak up the camera to take part in it. But we can take part in the film by being processed within the loop. And you weren't allowed to suddenly change the time frame at which you move something over to take a shot. So you're a performer, you have the same pleasure as the audience in that way, but you were two separate people. The artist creator and the artist participant could have been occupied by two different people in that sense.
So if I had, well, I suppose I was a participant because I was captured in there, so maybe just by being captured in.
But the question is, I suppose, one of them gives you pleasure. You know, you kind of really enjoyed being a performer. But was that kind of like a peripheral thing in a way, or was that kind of a core activity?
There's an aspect which maybe doesn't answer it, but maybe goes some way in terms of when, during that process, you described it to me as somehow it took you back to the actual physical activity of making the object, and the fact that you had to, because you made it by hand, you physically spent hours sanding surfaces and cutting and operating very directly with it, and so somehow that additional duration of period, which maybe you hadn't anticipated, somehow reflected that initial process of the object.
I think in terms of the object itself, the fact that it's so smooth and that it doesn't look like the animation that they want to make because you did it by hand. I think maybe you could have in theory added some tracks and put a little camera on the phone on the timer or something to get it to record you.
Well, yes, it could have been those ways, but I just wonder why
We chose not to.
I chose not to do it.
When you make the video, the fact, whether it had been there or not, the fact that there's no trace of that on the actual object gives it more life than this tripod, for example. I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that you physically took the pictures, but I think it's the fact that the apparatus doesn't look like an apparatus. It looks like a sentient object, of course. So even though you see the movement like a roller coaster, and it's very clear how the shot's been taken, and it could have been something mechanical, it feels deliberate. It feels like the object somehow is infused with animate life and is looking. Do you know what I mean? Whereas when I look at the result of the animation that you're taking with this tripod, I don't feel like this is an animate object. I feel like it's a recording device. And I feel like when I look at the film, I'm seeing recordings.
Because I can't figure
Yeah,
out.
do you want to just get rolling?
There's nothing obvious.
It's just the mouse, you've got to whiz the mouse over into there.
So what was it like having this thing within your rehearsal, within your space, in your environment?
It was very much in the middle. And it was the first time that we had gathered together, 6 performers, to show each other the works that they had individually made over a period of time. So they hadn't seen each other's work a great deal. So there was a nervousness in the room, and I thought, hell, I brought in Superman in the middle here. And I thought it could be a another tension. In fact, it wasn't. It was an occupation that everybody initially was worried about when they came in, and then they just went on working. So the tension drew them away from our dilemma, and we just got on with it, except that he was in the middle, which meant that we had to orientate, be careful of our orientation around them. And purely practically it meant that we worked quite often in this half of the room, not in that half of the room. So it looks as if we might be lazy. And we're not, because we're doing all of that.
There's some sitting around.
There's Matthias sitting here any minute.
You think it would have been different if it had been a person manually operating?
I think it would. I think we could forget this quite
Yeah,
easily.
because
And
there's
he
no-
didn't. It did. Sorry. It wasn't making a personal decision.
Yeah.
It was.
Doing what
It was noted. We knew what it was going to do, and we could get on. But we said something interesting downstairs. It's a shared place. So it didn't feel as if one or the other was necessarily dominating the plan. So we saw it from the other perspective. You see it from the apparatus perspective. And obviously we saw it from what we were doing and wondering what would be received, what information from here would be received here. We weren't worrying about it. It was just the absence of presence that could arrive at any point. And it was curious.
Did you feel like you were having a conversation with it in terms of the way in which you
No,
did
we
your work?
really got on with it. There was only, I think, one moment when, after lunch, Matteo came in and felt obliged to move towards the camera as some sort of recognition of it, and then went, "This is silly," and went back. But it's not capital. He said, "I just moved towards the camera." Why? But it was some recognition of the object when he came back in.
In the previous incarnation, it was installed differently, wasn't it? So that
It
there
was-
was feedback.
Yes, it was running continuously. It was installed at the Foundling Hospital Museum in Cornwall Fields, and it was running 24 hours a day, recording one frame every minute, so that over 24 hours it would record the full sequence of 1,440 frames. And what it would do, rather than just making a recorded video like this, which loops over and over and over again, and this is what we were hoping would be happening this evening, is that once it had completed the loop, and it would go back to frame 1, it would then re-record frame 1, replacing that image in the sequence. So after
Editing Amy. Kind of edit.
Yeah,
Which is essentially rewriting
and then rewriting and sort of recompositing the video so that after 24 minutes it would have rewritten one more second of the video. And so, but this changed, it's this idea that people then would react to the camera and they would go up to it, like the staff and the people who regularly were in the building began to know what it was doing. So they would actually go and wave at us and say hello, and it would they'd go look in the cafe and watch the film and see themselves on there. And
that seems quite generous as a proposition. The fact that it's kind of moving beyond the notion of a fixed outcome, in a sense, because it's consistently playing with itself and rewriting and destroying or being auto-destructive, I guess, in that process. So which is making me think that it takes it away from an idea of an artwork as an entity or as a fixed thing to engage with.
The interesting thing then is the film that's captured is kind of continuously being destroyed, isn't it? So it's not there as a device to make an artwork, it's a device to continually destroy and remake an artwork, or edit it, which is different, changes the value of the film, doesn't it, compared to the process.
well, then you can look at it more in the sense that as moments captured, it sort of makes it feel much more a live, ongoing thing. And just seeing this go round and round and round over and over and over, it was much more interesting than it was capturing the live.
It's interesting that you feel that so strongly, Because in a way that's the underlying motivation of making algorithmic work rather than work which is pre-scripted, pre-recorded and displayed, is that you find it much more interesting if it continues to evolve in front of the audience.
It makes it about that relationship to the space, doesn't it? It sort of, it's not about, making a beautiful finished aesthetic object. It's about, this is in space, it's changing, it's doing it now, it's continuous.
But that's what our opportunity in live performance. You can set work, and sometimes within that setting of a live performance, you can explore an enormous amount within the set, or within a parameter, the idea of making immediate choices. And I don't like banding the word improvisation around because it seems overused, but that idea of making choices that can shift the vitality of the work, but not necessarily its central idea. And that's the deliciousness of live, so that you are in a way rehearsing, constantly rehearsing for the next possible moment, rather than fixing the moment you're in.
And if you're repeating these sections of performance within the gallery setting, are you then, do you see that as still an open process in which that performance can evolve?
We're in the gallery for 6 hours a day.
This is for the new piece, yeah.
And we only have possibly between an hour and a quarter and an hour and a half's worth of work. So we will have to repeat it quite a bit over 2.5 weeks. And I think the dancers might divorce me later. But the fascination is once we've, I hope, early performances, early days will be understanding what we've made and evolving it. There'll be a moment in which we won't know what to do, because we will have hit some buffer. And the interesting thing is when we'll go through that buffer and find out what can be done with endless repetition.
So
not repetition is the same
very
thing.
open
It should be. But we might hit something in order to get into the next stage.
Have you set up a system whereby when you get to that point, the new parameters or the parameters start shifting, or is that not something that you...
I think it's going to be doing, but it's going to shift. We'll change the orders of how things come, partly to keep us frisky, and partly very practical. Some of them are going to need to pee, to eat, or to drink. So how to give them time, a longer time, factor in time that they can move out.
Those practical things could be quite interesting in terms
Exactly.
of the way that
We started to think about it today.
Yeah.
I mean, we abstractly thought about it, but we have to now definitely think
if
about it.
somebody needs to leave the room, so somebody else has a coming to take over their
Exactly.
place, and there's like a sort of shifting.
We'll find out a lot.
And how are you negotiating the fact of the audience within that, or perceiving?
It's a bit of guesswork at the moment because we haven't had enough people in the room. We've tried to think about where we wish to be placed, how we maneuver out into the space. One couple is very much wall-based, which quite fascinated me that we wanted one couple to be wall-based. One couple certainly moves out into the space, and one single person is negotiating who's doing the minutes and everything like that. But what will happen? This afternoon I saw what we had, and I could imagine just one person watching and it having an extraordinary quality. I have a bit of a problem, I imagine, maybe 30 people in the room. I don't know how we'll have to deal with it, but I haven't
The work
got to that stage.
doesn't engage with the people.
No. We made a decision very early on that we thought this should be the engagement. We weren't interested in the threatening either. I don't mean threatening. We use the word threatening. I'm not sure what I mean. That if an audience member came in, and we reacted to them, there was that dialogue which I don't really wanted to continue. We imagined that we would be at work and that the idea, if we were at work, that would allow the member of the public to come in and witness that and be able to move around it rather than feel they were causing a change.
Is that, I'm curious about that because I see a performance in this space where there isn't very much depth between, and there's very little distance between the performers and the public. The lighting is very much rehearsal lighting. Yes. Everyone's lit in the same way. And I'm curious about that. Do you still feel do you still get off-put by the public in those circumstances? Are you still afraid of that? I mean, obviously that's one of the ways it works.
Not afraid. I just don't want two things. I'm not particularly interested in discomfort. I like concentration rather than discomfort. I can get there. And one of the challenges that we have taken on as performers, and we're talking a bit about it downstairs, is there can be a tendency for dancers to look as if they've been enchanted, because they are in this movement mode that anybody who isn't a dancer doesn't necessarily go into that mode very often. And if they're really exploring the movement, they may feel as if the movement is inhabiting them. And we were trying not to get there. On the other hand, it is quite difficult if we're doing movement that is not everyday movement. The moment we move into action which might have been informed by imagination, then what is your performance when somebody's just wandering past you? I haven't got an answer. That's one of the things we're trying to.
What do you mean by discomfort?
I didn't want to get into a place where if somebody came into the room they felt discomforted because they thought, oh, they're very, very busy and I've just entered this room and I don't know what's going on. So that's where the minute idea came in. Our limitation, as apart from just the frame, was we would try and work within minutes. So if somebody came in, they would see a minute, then they would see another minute, and then they would see another minute. So they knew they weren't involved in development. So that would give them the comfort of knowing that they had arrived at the right time, whatever time they arrived. And from our point of view, we wanted to be not in the discomfort of going, oh, I wish I'd just seen the last bit. Or I don't know what to do when they've come in the room. So we wanted this idea that somebody could slip into concentration as quickly as possible.
They contain people, they don't engage outside of their...
Yeah. I'm trying not to go down contained, but I probably have without knowing it. But I think we've fallen down some traps. Or not traps, I don't think we've fallen down traps. We've walked in happily into some situations we said we weren't going to go into. And we'll see.
In some ways, it's a similar challenge for filming art in galleries. There's the two ways of showing. One where people sit around like this, and it's screening times, but much more commonly it's just running on the loop. And there is that attempt to make it permanent, so that you can approach the film at any point, not feel disadvantaged.
Is performers who are engaging like they're alive and they can respond to the film typically doesn't have that two-way.
No, that's right. I mean, the only parallel, I suppose, is the choice of how much narrative you maintain. You have something which is continuous.
But there's still that tension in terms of engaging with artists' films, that initial point of engagement of where am I in some kind of sense of sequence. I'm actually now thinking of your piece Theatre at the Wellcome Trust and how because that was set across, I want to say 3 walls, but it kind of looped.
Yeah, it's 5 screens, but a continuous film. And with that, it's funny, it did have a beginning, middle and end, but it was, I wouldn't want anybody to sit through it, because the narrative was really quite bland. It was the exact time from Camp Bastion to Kandahar in an aeromed flight in the back of a Hercules, and so the film is entirely the inside of the Hercules. And you see quite mundane tasking for a lot of patients in almost pitch blackness. So the intention is that you can somehow allow yourself to, through the addition of peripheral vision, to suspend disbelief a little bit and begin to empathize with something which is so far removed from normal experience. Even the soldiers never mind how slick it is. But, you know, for some people, they just see the end. You see the ramp going down and the light flooding in, and they're like, oh, it's at the end, you know. But of course, the end doesn't really matter, because that's just the end to an unknown, and the beginning was the same, light flooding in. The important thing for me was that I didn't have to choose the duration. It was a real duration based on a real place and a journey that I completed. The strange thing in that case was it was a simulation. And it was the last day of training for the medics that had never been to Afghanistan, who were about to be sent out there. So it was in a plain ground, an aeroplane with no wings. You go inside a big kind of, it was a big white shed, and inside, when the ramp goes up, within about 5 minutes, I and a few of the instructors had already been to Afghanistan, and you know, we started to forget we were in a big white shed, and they obviously did, because they were so scared of getting it wrong. Since it was a week's time they'd been doing this in the pitch blackness without anybody to tell them if they'd done it. So the fact that I could suspend this week made me consider that it'd be interesting to see if people with no emotional kind of obsession with the same subject could also suspend this week, and then it's based on my own limited empathy with the printed and filmic media that I've seen in quite well. So the time frame there, the narrative aspect was present, there was a logic for it, but it was wholly irrelevant to the meaning. It was purely there as kind of attempted as a framework, a simple solution.
And how were you negotiated as a kind of exterior to that scenario, in the same way that potentially Rob was today, like drawing that?
It's interesting because the 30 days I was out there, the whole point in a way was me trying to kind of make myself as invisible as I could. And it's a great embarrassment being the only person without a role in an environment where everybody has, you know, a uniform and a function. And it's in a very practical sense, you're trying to, it would be lovely to be able to find a mechanism that can be the observer so that you don't have to be. And a few times I used the camera to do that when I was couldn't face watching things in with the hope of relation analysis. But it was interesting, you know, in that particular run, I met them that day, and you know, I filmed this one day, their last day of training, and of course they were acutely aware of me. But it's something which does fade over time, isn't it? And the important thing for me in both cases, in the footage and the photographs and the diary entries from being out there, and from that one day, was that in no way was my role as the observer actually the subject of the work that was in the show, because it was the least consequential part of the subject.
Sorry, just one thing, because you both said something. You both said one thing about this idea of there being a larger amount of time, and both of you turned around and said you wanted not to have to be the decision maker necessarily about the large time, even though yours is a small time. And I've said I've got 6 hours, but I did want to be very decisive about the small time also, so that when a minute is produced, we thought it should each minute should be an accurate whole, that it shouldn't be a random, wouldn't be random. It shouldn't just be a minute and then a minute and then a minute of progressive stuff, but each minute should be a very, very particular whole moment, shaped. We use the word shaped like a song, as if it was, each minute was constructed, and that felt important.
And in relation to this, maybe thinking back to David's car piece in terms of the notion of editing, or how, and equally, I guess, with Rob in terms of the camera moving around and stopping to take a still shot and then moving again. How do you delineate that edge between those moments or phases? Is there
that's risky, isn't it? Because it ends up being one bit where you could potentially reveal your own kind of bias or tendency or aesthetic judgment, which might, in a way, make it a very specific piece, you know, and it might alienate it from some people, and it should be something they can empathise with. With my project, I set myself another rule. In car culture, I just said that the license plate would be credited for every participant. So it flashed up with the license plate in between shots, and that was the end of it. But the font I chose was probably wrong.
So you use that as a device to...
Yeah, just use it as a cut device, from one clip to another. So the clips were random length, and not random. They were dictated by how long the person was interacting with me.
Yeah.
But they were always framed by the credit for the participants. But you can't ever. I mean, the whole point is in a way it's an illusion. You can't ever remove yourself in time. The font, the background colour I chose for that whiteboard, the rules in the first place, the reason for driving extension lines now, I'm not 65, and all these things mean you are present. It's just a matter of trying to shift the dominance of kind of activities so that people concentrate more on some activities that you want them to consider than the other ones which you feel are less important. And so it's the same with games development. They're never neutral. You may feel like there's probability and random choice and that kind of thing, but there's a lot of control, and it's an illusion that you're already free to run.
So is that revealing a process of decision making to the audience?
Well, for me, it was about trying to play down the process of decision making as much as possible in that case.
But like the idea of documentary actually telling the truth.
Well,
it typically doesn't, in terms of you can edit the same piece of footage and you can tell 100 different stories, so inherently the editor's role in that utterly directs, particular narrative they want to. I mean, maybe the choice of, the choice of exposure on your, when there are all sorts of different inputs you could have put into even just the camera that you have there, could have actually affected.
I put a wide angle lens on to try and get a bit of the space, and that, of course, you do make choices, but I suppose it's that thing of once it's deployed, it's running, and at that point, that's I wouldn't sort of in the times when it was repeating, there'd be particular frames or incidents which were great moments, and you had to enjoy them while they were there because you knew that they'd be gone within the 24 hours. And so you couldn't suddenly, because you could technically go to the computer and make sure that those two were saved and you could leave them in position. And so, you have to, at some point, just stop and say, no, these are the rules, and step back. And, but I think with the piece downstairs, it was more difficult because I was doing it manually. Of course, I was thinking, this is going to be more interesting if there's people in here. So then, when the classes ended at 12 midday, and I knew there'd be a rush of people coming down, and I realised the camera was halfway around the loop pointing at the floor. And this guy went, I've got to speed up. So I rattled off like this series of things, and so, it's just, I found that really interesting because I was in this dilemma between the machine, the system, and me as an active agent within it who could affect the outcome of the film that was produced. And, but I suppose it was possible that the camera may have panned around the room this afternoon, and because of where Sue and her dancers were, it could have captured absolutely no activity. And I thought it was really important that Sue didn't try and perform in front of the camera. It was just a genuine rehearsal. So, although you are manipulating the view of the truth, it's kind of, there's that attempt to sort of remove yourself as a subjective agent within it. But it's just, of course you can't, and then, especially when it becomes apparent that you are there, then it throws up the whole conversation, and that's possibly when it's interesting.
I like the idea also that didn't quite technically work, that we would get each frame as it arrived, each shot as it arrived downstairs, so it would accumulate over a period of time. I'm sorry, I know you couldn't do it, but it's a good idea. It will happen. It will happen one day.
We'll have to play with your network for a while.
David, you talked about, when we were downstairs earlier, an idea of democracy within the whole.
Yeah, I suppose it relates back to that attempt to deny subjectivity, which is obviously flawed. It's this attempt to, and it relates a little bit to what you were saying. But when we're talking about your dual role as this kind of the participant and the programmer or the rule maker, and I've made some pieces which do algorithmically generate, so you set them running and come back a week later and you'll be surprised by what you see. Well, I'd be surprised by what I'd see. Despite knowing the parameters and probabilities, I wasn't clever enough to really predict exactly what was going to happen. I just got a sense of the trends that might develop. And it's interesting then because when you then go to your own exhibition surrounded by people that you don't know, you're actually watching for the first time something which you haven't seen before, so you have no kind of real additional privilege. You have the understanding of possibly why the behaviour is the way it is, what the limits are in terms of the intelligence of the little components, but realistically, in terms of the aesthetic result, that thing we keep mentioning, which is this kind of occasional happy accidents, that the kind of beautiful image that's created, or the kind of sometimes just something which is just pleasing just because of the way it configures itself. You'll see it for the first time, or you may not see it when your audience does. And that can be interesting. And I think for me, one of the reasons I wanted to make artwork rather than playing with cello or something like that in front of the audience was, in a way, an ability to step back a little bit from being identified entirely with the object while it's running, so that I can kind of stand at the edge and watch, kind of curious and kind of in a way accept that although it's derived from my own personal obsessions, it's not me, and that means that maybe I then have more of an ability to criticise it emotionally, kind of like respond to it and analyse what's failed as well as what's succeeded than I would do if it was me standing there. And that's just personal. There are other people that can do that, can actually act or dance and critically appraise their own work, but for me I recognise that's really too hard for me. So there's a certain safety distance which you can achieve by, to some extent, allowing the work to progress on its own away from you.
And the fact of systems or processes within that kind of amplify or mediate or make that much more possible, I guess.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. The modular thing is fun because you can set up some rules for something which is impossible for you to build on your own. And one day it can be built to the nth degree, something which is far greater than you might have originally imagined. But it would still be your modular system. It's interesting that you can have something which will be extended beyond your imagination.
What do you think about the idea that all these systems that one sets up and allows to play out is in fact actually is a kind of performance or a substitute for performance? It's a way of marking each instant which one does when one's doing something live. There's an ephemerality about it, but it's a way of being able to have that process happen whilst being removed from it oneself. I don't mean that as a form of laziness, more maybe a form of obsessiveness. Just wondered.
Maybe that's in relation to your role in terms of your relationship to the dancers or that activity.
Well, okay, like if one's performing, say, well, I've never sort of done a choreographed dance, unless trying to do Highland dancing. But, so say one's dancing or playing music or in play, and anything live, just talking, there's an ephemerality. It's like there's a sort of feeling if one focuses on the instant passing by, that one's kind of surfing on the edge of time unfolding. So if you set up a system whereby time is always being marked, so for example, you're constantly replacing frames at the beginning of the piece, time's shifting, there's an ephemerality. I kind of think of that sometimes as a way of, it's almost like performance, but having removed one's completely absent, but there is still this element of, of performance, something live, and ephemeral occurring.
With the time shift and
Yeah,
frame.
yeah. Just wondered what you thought about
I was just, when you're saying that, John, I was thinking about my Windscale work, which is this live video which sends images onto the desktop of your computer throughout the day from remote sites. So currently it's installed on a school in Hadley Wick, and it's responding to the speed of the wind and generates a pixelated live image from the site according to the speed of the wind and updates it on your desktop. But I totally get what you're saying, that you're there and it's sort of time is going on and I might be completely misinterpreting.
It's a kind of proxy.
Yeah, it's just, and it's like what David was saying, that there's a kind of a surprise in the outcomes, and although you know what the parameters are.
It's less of a guilty pleasure. If I had to try and edit together a really kind of smooth film, I'd be answering for a start, trying to professionally edit a film, but also kind of, in a way, feeling guilty for manipulating the footage to try and make something that was, kind of naturally kind of easy to follow for no reason that I can immediately think of, because it wasn't for a broadcast environment, that kind of language. But if there is something which is causing that periodically to happen through probability or luck or whatever, then there is you can enjoy the pleasure of kind of composition or of aesthetics or of sequencing or timing or a spatial relationship with the audience, all these things which in a way to dictate it. You might feel that you were allowing yourself to be kind of unduly distracted from the thing which you were trying to deal with right at the heart of the subject, with all of that as kind of aspirational but not the core requirements of the work. Do you know what I mean? With the London Transport piece, what happened was that the poor quality of the CCTV cameras around this place, none of which had been used yet, because it was the IRA 65, so they hadn't trained the operators yet. When we switched them all on, some of them had the most glorious kind of theatrical lighting on them, just really amazing views down these corridors that the neon lighting ended up being, they looked like I'd deliberately lit them nicely. Other ones which were totally bland and strip lights. But it was wonderful, because if I deliberately lit them with theatrical lighting, I would have felt guilty for manipulating the reality of the situation, because it wasn't about that. But you can enjoy the pleasure of just extracting things which were already there, which I hadn't realised before. Because in a way, by just being a witness to something that's already there, or something which is a byproduct of something else, you can enjoy it without that necessarily subverting your kind of intentions. That intention was all to do with, in a way, just kind of recognising that there were systems we were part of that weren't documented at that point.
It's also such a loss slightly when you're talking about things being eating themselves and self-destructing, and again, there's a temporality of a single performance that you only maybe see once and then isn't recorded so you never see again. There's a sense of kind of like there's a sort of anxiety for the loss of something incredibly beautiful. As you say, you saw some images that you were like, really would have loved to have saved, but that was against the rules. So, you kind of keep them in your mind. Those are the things you'll remember most, actually, the ones that you've lost, in a way. So there's a kind of...
But that must be common with live performance, isn't it? I mean, theatre and dance, and it must commonly be the situation where you recognise you've seen an extraordinary performance, and it may have been filmed, but even if it has, it won't be the same as actually kind of being there. So there is this real pleasure of being a witness, and also a sense of loss, If an actor or an actress is getting old and you realise that this may be the last time they do this run, and it's that kind of wonderful poignancy of recognising that you were just there to witness it. It makes it special. And I suppose in some ways that also allows you to step back a little bit from the way in which art has kind of for a long time become a transportable, reusable object, which in theory can enrich any environment by deliberately making that impossible. It kind of frees itself from one particular baggage which is attached to it and allows it to maybe kind of aspire to re-enter some of the more formative strands of arts.
So you're saying in a way you're trying to get rid of that idea of permanence, but in a funny way by creating a system that can be permanent, there's a different kind of permanence that can go on, but I can see how there's...
It's unresolved, isn't it? But one of the original intentions was not to make commodifiable objects, things which you buy and sell luxury goods. It was something about making something out. I quite like the idea of something being dismantled and destroyed at the end. But it grew into something which was more about, in a way, setting up an experience which wouldn't normally be had through the intervention of components or actions that you might make. And I think it still relates the same mega domain that the artist has when they decide to try and mark, their vision on a canvas. But it's interesting because you can. It's a different way of experiencing the same kind of pleasure, kind of controlling the perception of a space temporarily.
The language that you're using is the permanent. The words themselves, the content, what you're describing with that language is not the permanent thing, but the language itself kind of continues through.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You end up documenting all these things anyway, so there's no such thing as a permanent record. But the permanent record of things which are spatial or things which are technological in this case, the documentation in flat media is always limited, and it always relies really on quite a lengthy description of prose or kind of technical explanation, or ideally rich media as well to mix in with that. All of this gets really convoluted compared to the experience of just being in the same room with something that might possibly just be elegantly helping you question the way in which film is normally a part of your life. So I suppose you hope that the device that you created offers a more elegant way to approach the same idea that could be documented in other forms.
And obviously, technically at this point, we should have all been rewritten into the script.
Just briefly, I don't know if this adds to it, but if when making something which is about to be performed or is in the process of being rehearsed, the dilemma is not to think of the end point. So you've been asked maybe to do a task, or you've been asked to achieve something, and it's incredibly important not to think of the end point, because this is going to have to come out in different sentences. Okay. I know I'm going to get there.
You're thinking about the end point.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about the end point. Thanks. No, it's shit. I really want to say this. If it's don't record this. If you're reaching a performance and you name the performance, you name what you have just done, and by naming it, you finish it. And really what you have to do is look at the performance at the rehearsal and then see what you have achieved, rather than trying to reach the naming. Did that make sense? Sorry, took a while to get it.
So is this sense of looking at opening?
It's leading, I mean, obviously all three of us seem to be quite interested in quite strict parameters, but it's somehow the parameters are guiding us towards a place that we do not know about and do not name, and may not even name when we get there, and that's part of the excitement.
Or somehow leading to a point which evades the fact of the point and the fact of
I think it's not a fear of subjective judgment, but I think it's a fear of subjective judgment before it's understood.
Yes.
So in a way, it's kind of like lock down all of the things that are beyond the capacity of time or emotional involvement or other things to define at that particular moment, and then allow the other bits, which you call focus, to run free. And for me, that's the element, that kind of isolating one element a little bit.
in order to have some kind of observation over it.
Yeah, so it's not nearly as clinical as a controlled experiment, but it is that kind of attempt to kind of elevate one element. It's often the element which has the probability or the randomness attached is strangely the core focus, even though you'd assume that was at least controlled, but somehow probability obviously is within parameters. That's the bit which hopefully will end up being most scrutinised and looked at more closely, whereas the bits which are pinned down by arbitrary regulation are the bits which hopefully kind of fade into the background and become less important. So you could do that with any number of different parameters and change the focus, radically within a single recording or something. And change it, from sound through to colour, through to lighting, through to the people involved, or whatever. But your choice will have a massive impact on what people share your scrutiny.
Fantastic. If anyone's got any further questions, and then I think that's probably an ideal place to find not an end point, but a cause of some description. So I would like to thank David, Sue and Rob very much. I think it's been an interesting opportunity to have an open conversation with no fixed outcomes.